and would bring some closure here. And it's been quite a number of years already. We've had dramatic changes going on the last 2 years in Israel, as well as what's going on here in America. Okay, so Deanne Stone, we think about her every day, how she was involved with the Doctor family, Israel Action in Sisterhood, and everything that went on in Israel. I'm just going to say right now, currently at the moment, Mike and Barbara Richmond are there with the Grodman family visiting in Israel. Sue Rogen just came back from volunteering, her 4th time in the last 2 years, doing acupuncture and picking cabbages, among other things. And Warren will be going back for his 2nd time in Sarah L. And we've had quite a number of people here. Looking over here to Sandy and Norm, who are going back for, I don't know what, the 8th, 9th, 10th, 12th time. And they're working in Haifa with kids there. This is a congregation that so many people go back and forth to Israel. We know that Rav Chazan Ken and his family will be going there to see Zalman. We also, Rachel and Mike Holloway. Rachel Altora and Mike Holloway are going to be leaving just in a couple of weeks too as well. So we have a lot of people off to Israel. It's wonderful to see that they bring that spirit. Without further ado, let me introduce Harvey Stone, who's going to say a few words about Deanne.
Good morning. It's hard to believe that in February it'll be 19 years since Deanne died. Deanne was active in many organizations. She was active in Jewish organizations, the local, regional, national level, and in Israel, both as a professional and as a volunteer. But people who knew her won't remember her for her efforts and accomplishments in support of the Jewish community. They'll remember her for the relationship they had with her. Deanne had a special way of interacting with people. My son-in-law said that a friend of his who had just met her for a short time could not stop raving about her. She touched the hearts of many, and for that she will be remembered. I'd like to thank the Sisterhood and Israel Action Committee for keeping her memory alive with this annual event.
Thank you very much, Harvey. Is Tracy here? Please come on up, Tracy, just to speak on behalf of Sisterhood, and we certainly want to thank Sisterhood for putting together the breakfast that we have this morning, and especially for Debbie Needleman for putting everything together. Appreciate it.
Good morning, everyone. What a great turnout. We'd like to thank Harvey Stone, who provides a donation so that we have all this wonderful food. I'd also like to thank Debbie Needleman, our chief cook, and her crew, Judy Fishman, Elaine Fleischer, Randy Singer, Marcia Zimmerman, Karen Block, Sue Schofeld, Sue Rogen, Warren Manning, Alyssa Talamo, Amy Friedman, and Neil Friedman, and we also had some help from our dear friend Phyllis. She doesn't need a last name.
And Svi and Dahlia.
So,
And Svi and Dahlia. And Svi and Dahlia.
Oh, and Svi and Dahlia, sorry. They weren't on the email. So, enjoy the wonderful food and the speaker, and thanks for coming.
Thank you very much. Steve, come on up. We're just going to have Motzi in a moment. If I can ask everyone just to silence or turn the volume down on your phone so we won't have any... Amen. Please get up now and help yourself to the wonderful food. There are 2 entrances at both ends of the tables and both sides. Also,
Anniversary of October 7th, and as well for doing the lovely centerpieces today. Secondly, to Mike Holloway for his dedicated maintenance of the Israel Proud Facts section in each week's Shabbat flyer, educating our congregants about Israel's amazing accomplishments, as well as doing the videography today. To the 236 individual participants in our Natick Four Corners effort, who stood every Sunday for 2 years in downtown Natick for the hostages, and to my better half, Warren Manning, for being the primary organizer of this program. To Marco and his staff who worked behind the scenes to set up the social hall for today. And a huge thanks to Debbie Needleman for organizing this amazing breakfast and for putting up with us, for continually asking her to increase the amounts for more and more registrants. Debbie, we have a little gift for you.
Oh, thank you.
And now to Mr. Jonathan Tobin. Jonathan S. Tobin is the editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, JNS.org, the world's leading and fastest-growing news source devoted to the coverage of Israel, the Jewish world, and the American political scene. Mr. Tobin is a senior contributor to The Federalist, as well as a columnist for Newsweek and a contributor to many other publications. Professionally, he covers on a daily basis the American political scene, foreign policy, the U.S.-Israel relationship, Middle East diplomacy, and the Jewish world and the arts as well. He is the host of JNS Think Twice podcast, as well as the Jonathan Tobin Daily podcast, both available on major audio platforms and on YouTube. Previously, Mr. Tobin was the first executive editor and then senior online editor for the chief political blogger for Commentary magazine. Prior to that, he was the editor-in-chief of the Jewish Exponent in Philadelphia, and before that, he was the editor of the Connecticut Jewish Ledger. He has won more than 60 awards for his commentary, arts criticism, and other writings. He appears regularly on television, commenting on politics and foreign policy. Born in New York City, he studied history at Columbia University. Today's topic is why 2025 has been a year of victory for Israel and the Jews, despite the blood libels and a surge in anti-Semitism. The pro-Israel community is actually winning, and the Jew haters are losing. Please hold your questions till the end of his speech, and then we'll have a Q&A session afterwards. Please join me in welcoming the esteemed Mr. Jonathan Tobin to Temple, Israel.
Good morning, and thank you so much for that very generous introduction. And whenever I hear the whole thing read out, I'm reminded of Henry Kissinger's famous line about introductions. And if my late parents were here, my father would have enjoyed it, and my mother would have believed it. I want to first thank you for inviting me to your synagogue. This is the synagogue I know of the late Rabbi Harold Kushner, and as part of the generation that read Honey from the Rock and all of his writings and was inspired by it when I was young, it is very cool for me to be here and to speak at his shul. I also want to thank the Grodman family, because I know they are funding this annual event in honor of, I believe, Brian's father.
That would be Hobby Stone.
Hobby Stone?
Is
Okay.
the one sponsoring this.
Hobby Stone, okay, excuse me. I want to give credit to everybody,
Sure.
and thank you to all of them. There is an old Jewish joke that speaks of what is the content of a Jewish telegram. Now, most of you here today, I can see as I look out of the faces, are too young to know what a telegram actually is, right? You look at on TCM, there are movies where people deliver telegrams. And a telegram was basically a text that was written out on a piece of paper and then delivered in person. And so, but back in the days when there were telegrams, the joke was, what's a Jewish telegram? And a Jewish telegram reads, start worrying. Details to follow. And that is pretty much, that sums up modern Jewish life. And speaking as someone whom it could be said, who covers the daily Jewish world politics, it could be said that I do a lot of Shrine Gewalt for a living. But I also am here to tell you that the catastrophizing and the Shrine Gewalt that characterize so much Jewish commentary today can sometimes lead us in the wrong direction. And the topic that I'm going to try to speak about today and share some thoughts, and then hopefully have questions and we can have some kind of dialogue, which might be more interesting than this speech, is to speak about how we can place all this doom and gloom in perspective. And I think that's very important, because as much as things are bad, and I'm going to talk about just how bad things are, it is not 1933 or 1939, as so many people tend to jump to that conclusion. And it is true, as bad as it can seem, that those of us who love Israel, who care about that, and who care about the disturbing surge in anti-Semitism, we are not losing. We actually are winning. And that is my argument for you today. Now, when we look at the world of 2025, about to be 2026, we are living, especially here in the United States, in a situation that most of us who are now alive have no experience with. I think if you grew up, in sort of the post-World War II era, as much as we lived in the shadow of the Holocaust, the threats to Israel, Soviet Jewry, all that, most of us did not experience anti-Semitism in the way we are experiencing it today in this country. The hate for Israel used to be something that happened somewhere else, not so much here. And it is different now. But the problem is not just, encampments on college. It's not just what someone is saying on the internet. We are living in an environment in which anti-Semitism has been, to some extent, normalized and indeed mainstreamed. To say this, we cannot discuss where we are in this world without acknowledging the fact that this is a phenomenon on both the left and the right. Left-wing anti-Semitism is institutionally based in ideas about Jews and Israel being white oppressors. This is part of the reigning orthodoxy on the left. But we're also experiencing a growing surge of anti-Semitism on the right. Now, the thing is, part of this is generational. Because if you only get your information about the world in general, never mind just Israel and the Jews, from your TikTok feed or wherever you are on social media, you might really think that we're living in 1933 and 39. Like, if you just live in my world of posting daily on all the social media feeds, and that's what, if you're a journalist, you have to live on social media because, as we say, that's where the eyeballs are. You can think that, this is Munich, in the Nazi era. You really can. Look at even the comments on the JNS YouTube videos that we post, and you should read our daily podcast. You should watch our podcasts and subscribe to our newsletters. But if you look at those comments, you think, my God, like the world's coming to an end. All these places, and they're not all bots. Some of them are bots, but a lot of them are people. Young people with left-wing views, young people with right-wing views. It can be very, very frightening. And the point is, if you don't know history or anything about the Middle East or the reality of Israel, the situation can seem incredibly dire. And I think a lot of us in the Jewish community, whether you're on the liberal end of the political spectrum or the conservative end of the political spectrum, each side is going through an awakening in which allies that you counted on no longer can be counted on. Right? It is sort of now axiomatic that both political parties are having trouble acknowledging their anti-Semites. I think it became very clear on the left and the Democratic Party, as we saw during the 2024 election, that President Biden and then Vice President Kamala Harris had made a political calculation that confronting the anti-Israel left was a bad idea. I'm not going to sort of weigh in like who was better on Israel, but the fact is neither of them were anti-Israel enough for the anti-Israel left. And when they were confronted with this in person, they were forced to, they decided, that they were not going, when Kamala Harris spoke somewhere, it happened a couple of incidents, I wrote about it, when she was confronted by someone, going on ranting about the Jews and ranting about Israel and genocide and floating all the blood libels. Her reaction was, you need to be heard, you need to be acknowledged. In essence, she was doing what, the left had accused Trump of doing when he spoke about the Charlottesville rally in 2017, where, he was talking about the people with the debate about the statues, but, it became an article of faith on the left that Trump had said that among the neo-Nazis there were some very fine people. But in truth, when Kamala Harris was confronted with that, and Joe Biden was, she was saying, well, you're very fine people too. That was a real problem. Of course, right now we're experiencing some of the same things on the political right when President Trump was confronted by Zohran Mamdani, the mayor-elect of New York City, ranting about Israel committing genocide right in front of him, and he's the most pro-Israel president we've ever had. He just let it go. He didn't say, wait a minute, no, you're not. It's like a lot of Jewish Republicans who were saying, please, don't let him get away with that. He let him get away with that. I'll go into it a little bit more later, but, Vice President Vance has been asked to disassociate himself from Tucker Carlson and his mainstreaming of anti-Zionism, not just merely anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, his whole war against the whole idea of a Judeo-Christian heritage. And Vance is completely silent about it, partly because Tucker Carlson's his friend and supporter, and partly because he too is making a political calculation that while if he's going to win in 2028, he needs more than the sort of groypers on the far right, but that maybe he can't win without them. That is part of the reason why people are catastrophizing about our situation. And, let's go into it a little bit more in that we are now in a situation where for a generation of young people have been educated whether in elite institutions or in K-12 schools, to believe in the myths of critical race theory, intersectionality, settler colonialism, in which Israel is demonized, delegitimized, and it's now where people like Ta-Nehisi Coates, the famous writer, can write a book, about Israel. He made a 10-day visit, his first visit to the Middle East. Like most of you have been on missions that lasted long, to Israel that lasted longer than that. And he walked away, and then he wrote a book about it. You really gotta love the chutzpah of it. And basically saying Israel is the Jim Crow South. It's an apartheid state, and that October 7th was justified. Although he wrote in a 200-page book about the Middle East that was published in the fall of 2024 without mentioning October 7th, without mentioning the word Hamas or terrorism. And this was greeted in mainstream media as entirely reasonable thing. And when just one journalist pushed back about him, he was nearly lynched by his colleagues. That's where we are. And truly, that has actually resonated over on the political right, because the same young people that have imbibed the poison that's coming from the left are imbibing a version of it that comes from the right. I'm not going to say necessarily that they're morally, that the balance is as great, because clearly the political right is still more pro-Israel by a great margin than the political left. But it is, as the writer Rod Dreher, wrote last month that 30 to 40% of young Republicans are sympathetic to the groypers, at least in Washington, among the people who are working in the administration or, living in the conservative ecosphere in our capital. And while I think that's an exaggeration, I'm not sure it's that much of an exaggeration. So this is a very serious situation. We have normalized Jewish hatred. We have, instances of actual violence, terrorism, Boulder, Colorado, what happened in Washington outside of a Jewish museum, the attempted firebombing of the governor's residence in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. We can no longer deny that this has leached over into actual violence. And indeed, even in terms of the general public, we've seen a decline in support for Israel in the polls, especially among young people, and an increase, as we saw in a recent Manhattan Institute poll, which discussed levels of anti-Semitism, where it seems as if 15 to 20% of people hold anti-Semitic attitudes. So why not catastrophize? Why not say that the world is coming to the end? Why not say we're really in trouble in a way that we have never been before in living memory? Why not say it's all doom and gloom? Well, the reality of our situation is nevertheless one in which we have to put all these terrible news, like everything you read in JNS every day, put it in perspective. Objectively, we are living in the best moment in Jewish history. We are uniquely privileged among all the generations of Jews, maybe dating back to Sinai, of living in a point where Jews are empowered, Jews are safer, we are stronger, the state of Israel is safer and stronger than it has ever been. And I say that even though we've just commemorated 2 years since October 7th. We lived to see the worst mass slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust. But I'm still telling you that as bad as things are, and I've just sort of given you a brief précis about why things are bad, we're still stronger. In Israel, I think it's a little more obvious, as much as even there we tend to catastrophize. The war began terribly 2 years ago with, a complete collapse of everything I've been told every time, how many times had I been taken to the border and given briefings by the IDF about why everything's safe, they were completely wrong. And the political consensus in Israel, which stretched, wasn't just Netanyahu, from the left to the right about what to do about Gaza, which was to say, just leave them there. That was a political calculation that, both Netanyahu and his opponents all basically believed in, with very few exceptions. Just leave them there, give them money, let the people come from Gaza to work. That's the best way. That was all wrong. And Israel was caught as unprepared as it had been almost exactly 50 years before. In Yom Kippur in 1973, but the consequences were in a way much worse, because in 1973, the people who died on the front lines were just soldiers. This time, the Israeli public was attacked. Ordinary Israeli civilians, men, women, children, were subjected to the horrors of Hamas and the Palestinians. But what happened after October 7th was something amazing. And that I think those of us who have been to Israel, several times since October 7th and have spoken to people who have sort of lived it and experienced it, I know many of you here have, as horrible as it was, every time I go to Israel, especially since October 7th, I'm inspired by the way people responded to it. Before October 7th, if you spoke to a lot of people in Israel, there was a lot of questioning. It wasn't just the political divisions about judicial reform and Netanyahu and all the seeming political civil war. It was like the current generation of Israel was not the equal of the founders, of the people who had fought in 48 and 67 and 73, and that Israelis were soft, they were leaving, and it was all terrible. What we discovered was that this generation of Israelis was just as, if not tougher, than their predecessors who founded the state and fought to keep it alive, and when that was in the existential threats of the past. This generation of Israelis responded in a way that, I can only compare to the America of our parents and grandparents who fought during World War II, with a sense that everybody's going to do their bit, and that we're going to unite, as much as we may dislike each other and be at war with each other in other contexts, we're going to unite and we're going to win. And that's what happened. Israel didn't lose. Yeah, sure, we can analyze a lot of things that went wrong, as in every war, and we could say, you could express, maybe, and I might agree with you that the ceasefire isn't everything it should be or will be. But the truth is, Israel won that war. Hamas was defeated. Hamas was devastated in Gaza, even if there's still some of them alive and terrorizing people inside a part of Gaza. They were beaten. The Palestinians know that. They saw what happened in Gaza because of their decision to go to war against Israel. Do you think Iran doesn't know that it lost the war that it helped foment? Their nuclear program is largely in ashes because they picked that fight. Do you think Hezbollah, which, if you spoke to, Israeli security analysts, they were like, I can only compare it to, it's like the parts of the Bible when, the spies that were sent into the land, into Canaan, by Moses, and they came back, we're like grasshoppers, they were giants. We were speaking of Hezbollah in the last 15 years as if they were invincible. That there was nothing Israel could do about Hezbollah because of what had happened in 2006 when they rained down missiles on northern Israel, and Israel wasn't prepared, and everybody had to flee their homes, and the first responders, didn't do well. Hezbollah was defeated. It wasn't just, the trick with the pagers. They have been fundamentally, what Israel did was to show that Hezbollah was a paper tiger. As dangerous as they were, and as to some extent still are, they're no match for the Israelis. They're no threat to northern Israel, as much as they inflicted so much misery on the people in the north who had to flee their homes. All the Jewish refugees from the north and the south of Israel. But in the end, Hezbollah lost. They no longer dominate Lebanon in the way they did because of the fight that they picked with Israel, because they supported Hamas, although not as much as Hamas would have liked. They were defeated. Iran, which fomented the seven-front war against Israel, they didn't win that war. They clearly lost it. And the correlation of forces, all the diplomacy going on vis-a-vis Qatar and all the Gulf State Emirates and the Saudis, it shows the Gulf states no longer are as afraid of Iran. Indeed, I would argue, and this is a bit counterintuitive and against what a lot of the pro-Israel crowd has been saying about the Saudis, they're going to formally recognize Israel, join the Abraham Accords. I personally think, I never thought that was actually going to happen, but I'm really convinced it's not going to happen now, because the main motivation for them, which was that they were far more afraid of Iran than anything else, is that they know Iran's not a threat to them in the way that it was, because Israel, with the help of the United States, defeated them. That's a fundamental change in the strategic equation of the Middle East. As much as we mourn what happened on October 7th and the sacrifice and the struggles of the Israeli people in dealing with it over the last 2 years, and I think many Americans don't really understand how hard it's been for Israel to have 300,000 reservists activated, and fighting and dying and losing nearly 1,000 soldiers. But Israel's enemies know that they lost that war. Let's not mistake that. We can view it from our point of view of the losses, but they know they lost. But even looking internationally, and again, it's easy to catastrophize because there is so much more anti-Israel sentiment. It's more mainstream. We hear it in a way that we didn't used to. European countries, whether it's Ireland or even France or Britain, obviously there's much more anti-Semitism, there's much more anti-Israel sentiment that's being voiced. And yet, those countries are still they're not boycotting Israel. let's understand another thing about Israel. It's, as much as it was shaken by October 7th, its economy, and believe me, Israel has economic problems. Paying for that war is a problem that nobody in Israel, certainly in the political class, most of whom really don't know that much about economics. I mean, Netanyahu's real distinction in Israeli politics is that he was like the only politician of his generation that knew anything about economics. Paying for that war is a problem that they haven't solved and may not solve for a long time. And yet, Israel's economy is still this first world startup nation colossus. The number of startups and purchases has not declined. It has only increased. Israel's economy has gotten stronger in the last couple of years in terms of its imprint on the world. The same European countries that criticize Israel and recognize the mythical state of Palestine, or whose broadcast authorities don't want to participate in this silly Eurovision song contest because Israel's part of it, they're still trading with Israel. They're still sending delegations to Israeli economic conferences and even military conferences to talk about the lessons that the Israeli military learned and how they use AI and all kinds of other things. They're still looking to Israel. Israel isn't, as much as Israel is isolated at the UN in some ways, it is still this enormous, punching way above its weight class. That hasn't changed. In fact, it's only grown stronger. Israel is stronger and more secure than it has ever been. And I think we need to understand that. Let's look in the United States. I briefly gave you this, sort of doom and gloom scenario about both the left and the right have their anti-Semitism problems, and the leaderships of both parties, although I don't put them quite equally in terms of how strong anti-Semitism is within the two parties. It's clearly much stronger among the Democrats, but it is also among the Republicans, and the leaderships of both parties neither are condemning it or trying to isolate it, and indeed, they are embracing that aspect of their faction. And that's deeply troubling. And that's something that is unprecedented because, it wasn't that long ago that anyone who had the views of, say, someone like Zoran Mamdani would not have been elected mayor in the largest Jewish city in the world, but that if they had been nominated by their party Democrats would have turned on him. Republicans would have turned on him too. And the truth is, they didn't turn on him. Now, granted, New York City is, just as maybe, Massachusetts isn't, the representative of all of America in terms of, red-blue divide. But still, that person, Zoran Mamdani, has been accepted by the political mainstream of his own party. And even Trump and Vance are, they're saying, well, let's learn from him. He's an interesting guy. They're not going to war against him, which is very disappointing to Jewish Republicans. And yet, let's understand something else. Most Americans are still with us. Yes, Israel is destroyed in the media on a daily basis. And that has an impact on polling. It has an impact on how politicians view things, but let's understand something about how the media operates and why things have changed. And on that score, with respect to Israel and anti-Semitism, I have bad news, worse news, but good news, which is not the way I usually do that good news, bad news thing. The bad news is that prejudice against Israel in the media, bias against Israel in the media, is really bad. It is outside of some parts of the conservative ecosphere or outside of some independent media. Certainly in the legacy corporate media, it is almost universal. Everybody coming out of journalism school is been more or less indoctrinated by the hard left with those myths of critical race theory, intersectionality, and settler colonialism. And they now dominate newsrooms, whether you're talking about the New York Times, the Boston Globe, the Washington Post, CNN, whatever MSNBC is calling itself these days. That's fairly universal, and it's not just bad, but the worst news, in addition to the bad news, is that it can't be fixed. The mainstream media really can't be fixed on Israel, because unlike in the past, where media bias against Israel was largely a function of ignorance, sloppiness, the way the media operates, it's almost a separate lecture about media bias against Israel. It was because people didn't know what they were doing, because they just took the easy way out and told the story from the point of view of whatever they said was the underdog. And if you caught them in a mistake, and our friends at a group like Camera, which I'm very supportive of, has been doing it for 40 years, correcting the mistakes. They play an important role, but the truth is, we can correct the New York Times every day. And if the current generation, as they become the editors, as they are now already the editors, they're not interested in the corrections. I referenced Ta-Nehisi Coates, the writer, and in the big picture, how important is he? But he actually is emblematic of how the media thinks, the liberal, sort of mainstream media thinks, because he's not that interested in facts. He doesn't know that many of them, which is convenient. But he's not that interested. He's interested in whatever the narrative that he's embraced, this narrative of Israel's the Jim Crow South, an apartheid state, and the Palestinians were living in an open-air prison, and they were right to do what they did on October 7th. So you could correct him, till you're blue in the face and forever, and it won't make any difference. He's not interested in being right, so the corrections don't matter. So that's the worst news. What's the good news? Corporate media doesn't matter that much anymore. Nobody's listening to them. They're listening to podcasts. So the thing about the 2024 election, it's a year ago, so it's ancient history, right? But it was the podcast election. Who was on the podcast? Who was on popular podcasts and whatever you think of them? From the right to the left. Nobody really cared who newspapers endorsed, if they endorsed. Their irrelevance of these bastions of media power was obvious. They couldn't control the narrative on the left or the right anymore. And, so they're irrelevant. Now that presents different challenges to those of us in the Jewish community and the pro-Israel community, because we have all these podcasts and we have all these independent media, and I'm the editor of Independent Media, JNS, which was founded to create, and we have our founder here, founders, Josh Katzen and Amelia Katzen, and they deserve, the appreciation of the pro-Israel community, to provide account. Yes, you should applaud. It was founded to create a counterbalance to existing Jewish media, which was as bad as the mainstream media. All the new media that exists now, it's no longer gatekeepers. Gatekeeping is an important issue. But it used to be, the news was what, 4 middle-aged white guys said every evening at 6:30 p.m., right? Some of us are old enough to remember that. Or whatever the editor of the daily newspaper or wherever you happen to live said. Well, those days are gone. The news is what, there are a million people, seemingly, deciding what the news is every day, every moment of every day, not just 6:30 at night, and that creates problems because a lot of them are terrible, illiterate, crazy. The Candace Owens, whose supporters litter my my social media feed with anti-Semitic threats and invective. So they're there, but there are also lots of good things. There is media that has broken out, what Barry Weiss did, at the Free Press, and now, oh my God, she's running CBS News. So things can change. So yeah, the independent media has revolutionized the media landscape. And that is the good news, because all that indoctrination doesn't control necessarily the narrative. It forces us to fight on different fronts and to be more nimble and to look in different places. But we're not lost. Yeah, we can't fix the New York Times and the Boston Globe, but who cares? We can go around them. Don't be obsessed with him. Yeah, it's like a lot of people, whenever I do cover what the New York Times does, and then inevitably someone will write to me, well, Jonathan Tobin reads the New York Times, so I don't have to. Okay, yeah, that's my job. But the point is, we are in a situation where it is a completely new media landscape, where independent media matters in a way that it never mattered before. Where all these podcasts, and I speak as someone who does a podcast, does more than one podcast, that matters. So we're in a situation where we can defend ourselves with a new activism. And it forces us to also see that most of America is not against us. Most Americans didn't vote for all this left-wing nonsense of intersectionality and settler colonialism and the woke catechism. It also didn't vote for Tucker Carlson's brand of horror, and Nick Fuentes and all the people in Candace Owens. They're not the majority either. Most Americans are still where they always were, fundamentally decent, caring about their income, angry that the political establishment in both parties ignored them, ignored what working class Americans thought. That's why Trump is president, because the political establishments of both parties ignored what most ordinary Americans were dealing with. And that's something a lot of people, certainly in our community, who are disproportionately representative among the credentialed elites, are very slow to understand. But we're in a situation that is very different. And we have to understand, let's go back to our history. American exceptionalism is still real. Now, it could go away if the woke and the paleoconservative brands of fighting against Western civilization win. It's like the far left wants to destroy the Western civilization because they think it's racist and terrible. Tucker Carlson wants to destroy the whole idea of a Judeo-Christian heritage because he hates Jews. And all of his. So they're both. But you know what? Most Americans still like Western civilization. They still want to live in the country that we all grew up in. And there is a broad consensus in this country that is not anti-Semitic. Sometimes we can forget that. We think, all the people in flyover country, you speak especially to people on the coast, in our community. And, they think that most Americans, they're just a bunch of ignorant hayseeds, and they hate Jews, and they would kill us all if only they were smart enough to figure out how to do it. And let me tell you, that's not America. Most Americans care about Israel, they support it. Most Americans do not hate Jews. This country is still exceptional. It's under attack from people who want to destroy that exceptionalism, but it is still that country. Question is, how do we tap into that? I think how we tap into it is by being more assertive in standing up for ourselves. One of the most discouraging aspects of what happened in the last 2 years in this surge of anti-Semitism in this country, which most of us were not prepared for, even some of us who schreigewalt about anti-Semitism for a living weren't prepared for it, is that the reaction when campuses became overrun with pro-Hamas mobs was to tell Jewish students to shelter in place, to not confront them, not to go out and demonstrate in turn. And indeed, the Jewish community, yes, they demonstrated in their own environments, but we didn't challenge what happened aggressively. We were too worried about it. We failed in many ways. Our leadership failed. They weren't prepared for this, both psychologically and let alone how to challenge it. The proper response is something that those of us who grew up in the era, of Soviet Jewry activism should understand, is that we go out and counter-demonstrate ourselves. I grew up in the generation where, we were out in front of the Soviet consulate. We were out, demonstrating for what we believed in, and it was, the Jews are doing their thing. That was an era where there was a lot of demonstrating. It's somehow, we expect Jewish kids, we want them bubble wrapped, and I speak as a parent myself, we're worried. Don't upset the apple cart. Don't get in trouble with authorities. Don't jeopardize your admissions. We have to throw that out. We have to be more assertive. We have to show that we're ready to stand up for ourselves if we want other people to stand with us. And believe me, other people are ready to stand with us. We have plenty of friends, both among ordinary Americans and in the political class. And it's not because AIPAC is buying them, it's because they know. AIPAC is, is demonized by both the left and the right. But the truth is, it's a pygmy in terms of Washington lobbies. I mean, if there are AIPAC people here right now, I don't want to step on your toes and make you feel bad. Because, part of the success of AIPAC is to convince everybody that they are this, that they are what the anti-Semitic conspiracy theorists claim them to be, that they are this all-powerful thing, so fall in line. It's a big, it's a big joke. Of course they're not. There's hardly a professional, an industrial lobby that doesn't throw around more money than AIPAC does, big pharma, the oil, you name it, they're all more important than that. Qatar is more important in Washington than AIPAC. If you don't believe that, you haven't been following politics the last 8 years, both under Democrat and now on a Republican administration. And again, that's a whole separate topic we could just spend a whole day discussing. But the truth is, most Americans are with us, so we have to show that. We have to be, and so my message to you is not just wake up, it's not 1933, it's not 1939, don't, stop hiding under the bed, stop making plans to leave. If you want to make Aliyah, that's great. That's the highest form of Jewish activism. Most of you are not going to do that. But the point is, get up and stand up for yourself. The most important virtue, the most important element that we can do for our children, our grandchildren, ourselves, yes, we have to educate them. We have to know the facts. We have to be armed with the ammunition to conduct the arguments in a way that is coherent. But more important than that is one word: courage. We have to have the courage to speak up for ourselves and the Jewish people and Israel. We have to show that in everything we do, in our daily lives, in our willingness to speak truth to power, whether it's confronting our allies, our former allies, our faithless allies on the left, or our uncertain allies on the right. We have to have courage, and we also have one other thing: faith. Faith in the justice of our cause, faith that it is going to win and that history is on our side. And that's where what I was speaking before about the strength of Israel comes in. Israel is stronger than ever. The people who dream about destroying it are blowing smoke. It's not going away. They can no more destroy Israel than they could flap their arms and fly to the moon. And Zohar Mamdani, whose entire animating force of his a very successful political career has been anti-Israel activism, hatred for Israel. Basically, this anti-Semitic idea that you can destroy half the Jews in the world, deny Jews rights that you wouldn't deny to anyone else. And yet, it's all futile. Israel isn't going away. We must draw courage from that and have faith that we are on the right side of history, because we are. We have arrived at a point, no, history hasn't ended. There are challenges before us, some of the most grave challenges that the Jews have faced in the last century. We are under siege in many ways, and yet we are still winning this war. Why do you think they're so angry? Why do you think they're so frustrated? Because they see that Israel isn't going away. They may want to wish it away, just as the Palestinians are still stuck in this century-old mindset that they can wish Israel away. It's not happening. Every time they try to do something to effectuate that, they get weaker and they suffer more. Will they ever wake up? I don't know. I'm a journalist. I talk about the world as it is. I'm not a fortune teller. But what I can tell you is that the reality of 2025, 2026, the world we are living in, is one in which the Jews are not losing. Israel is not losing. We face many challenges, but we are still winning. We're stronger than we ever were. That blue and white flag is still flying over Jerusalem, and the person who will tear it down not only hasn't been born, isn't even the gleam in his ancestor's eye. Take faith from that. Let that give you the courage to speak up. I know many in this room do have that courage because you're a group of activists. We have to convey that to our neighbors, our fellow congregants, our relatives. You know, we either do or don't argue about politics on Thanksgiving. But understand this. For all of these problems, you know, we're only a week away from Hanukkah, right? The essence of being a Jew, since the days of the Maccabees to today, has always been a refusal to bow down to the idols of popular culture. In the past, those idols were Hellenism, the Roman Empire, you know, the Universal Church. Today, it's wokeism. Tomorrow, it might be something else. But we must always stand up to it. We need the courage to do it. We need the faith to understand that we are the inheritors of a tradition that has not been conquered, will never be conquered. You know, I just did a podcast a couple weeks ago with someone who wrote about the war. Great book, Barry Streiff wrote a great book about Jews versus Rome. And like, it's a terrible history of the three wars of the, moral of the story, don't pick a fight with the world's only superpower. But, 2,000 years later, who won? It's like, where's the Roman Empire? Well, like Italy is, okay, the Italians are still there, but they're not ruling the world anymore. The Jews, whom they tried to erase, they changed the name of the land of Israel. They destroyed Jerusalem. Jerusalem was rebuilt in our day. Every generation since that era has prayed for this. We're the ones who have the zchut, who have the privilege to live to see it. That's why you should never give in to the counsels of despair. We are the inheritors of a great, proud, courageous people. We've lost some battles. We'll still lose some battles. There'll be plenty of reasons to mourn because that's the human condition. But we have won. We're going to continue winning. Have the faith to keep doing that. Have the faith, convey that faith to kids who are maybe thinking that this isn't such a good thing to be associated with. On the contrary, our tradition is one in which we should all not merely take pride, but be inspired by, just as we should be inspired by the courage of the Israeli people as they won this war. Let's win too. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much for that inspiring talk. If I may, it reminded me of when we started our Four Corners program in late October of 2023. There was a lot of angst among people in our congregation about we're going to be out there demonstrating in the middle of Natick and what will people think. And I can tell you it was almost overwhelmingly positive. Sometimes, some weeks I would count how many toots or thumbs up we'd have, and it was well over 98% of people supporting of what we were doing. So I think you just have to have some courage and get out there. Questions? Alex.
I have a couple of things. Like, first of all this social media, for young people, they practically feed you. If you want, you can find anything you want, but they feed you. If you want to find how bad is Israel, it will feed you this. That's one moment. Second, you didn't say anything about Muslim anti-Semitism here. And what I saw when, I was in some demonstration for Israel, our side was peaceful. Police would separate us. And it was absolutely relaxed police on our side because we behave. But police was very anxious against another side because they don't, and we are afraid to break the law. They don't. There are no League of Defense, Jewish Defense League anymore. So how we fight this? Thank you.
Well, that's a very important point, and I probably was remiss. I should have, when I was going into talking about all the things that are bad, this bizarre red-green alliance of Marxists and Islamists, which dominates college campuses and certainly in Europe is a major political factor. That's part of the negative environment. And you're right, we are confronting an increasingly aggressive Islamic movement in this country, the Muslim Brotherhood. We're in an interesting situation. I was discussing, I take the podcast that will come out this next week. On the one hand, President Trump signed an executive order beginning the process that hopefully will designate the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization and its various branches in this country, which includes groups like CARE, the Council of American Islamic Relations. At the same time, they're cozying up to Qatar, which is lobbying very hard to get Trump not to do that. This is and it's also a factor in what happened in New York, although, Muslims do not outnumber Jews, but unfortunately, a lot of Jews who are, dyed-in-the-wool Democrats voted for Mamdani anyway, or because, some of them on the far left in the People's Republic of the Upper West Side don't like Israel any more than he does. The Peter Barnards of the world. That is, listen, that is one of our major challenges, for sure. But let's understand something. As dangerous as that is, they don't have the same political strength that we have. They don't have the sympathy, when they speak out loud what they want, as they do at times, whether they're besieging synagogues, as they did in both New York and Los Angeles recently, because they had a pro-Israel events, they're going against what most Americans believe. Most Americans believe in the Judeo-Christian heritage. Tucker Carlson's, blowing up, he's barking up the wrong tree when he's going to war against that, because most Americans believe in that. Most Americans believe in their Bible. They may not believe what, NBC, ABC, CBS, and, CNN say about most things, but they believe their Bibles, which is why there's so much support for Israel in this country. Support for Zionism is baked deep into the political DNA of America. The first president to endorse a Jewish state wasn't Harry Truman or even Woodrow Wilson. It was John Adams. We're not too far from his home, right? We're on, again, as bad as that is, and it's concerning, and it's something that Jews have been very slow because they're very afraid of being called Islamophobic. Of course, what is Islamophobia? Now, in theory, it's prejudice, against Muslims, the same as anti-Semitism is prejudice against Jews. But in practice, Islamophobia means just noticing the fact that the Muslim community or the people who speak for the Muslim community are anti-Semites. That's Islamophobia. So, again, we have to have the courage to call that out, to bring that to the attention of our political leaders, and to make it clear that we have the support of most Americans against that. They don't want this. They don't want Sharia law. And they not only don't want Sharia law, they don't want politicians like Ilhan Omar, and her, community of, Somali fraudsters to dominate our politics. Let's talk up about that. Let's have the courage to say that. It's not prejudice to point that out, that, those who care about, not offending the Ilhan Omars and the Zoran Mamdanis of the world don't speak for most Americans. And that's something we have to do. Again, courage, faith. Often we lack it, and that's why I'm talking about it.
Hi. You've been broadly supportive of the Abraham Accords for some time. Do you think that continued support for this diplomatic path is maybe the best way of dealing with the Palestinian problem?
In a broad sense, yes. I mean, the genius of what the people in the first Trump administration did when they really created this outreach and, recognition of the Emirates and, the countries, and broadly speaking with the Saudis, approval, was that, it gave a permission to other Arab and Muslim countries to no longer be held hostage by the Palestinians. That it was clearly in their interest to trade with Israel, to look to Israel as an ally against Iran, and that the Palestinians were, because most of the people in the Trump administration, they're all, real estate people, and the Palestinians are like the owner of a rapidly depreciating property. Its value is just going down, and their ability to sort of speak for the Arab world, to dominate it, is declining. So of course the Abraham Accords make sense, but there are limits to how long, and I alluded to that. There are limits to what the Abraham Accords can achieve. It cannot fundamentally sort of transform the Muslim world and Arab world, because it's not just the Palestinians. Anti-Semitism runs through that tradition, and they're at war with the West, as much as they are with Israel. So I don't, I think the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia wants to modernize his country, but he also knows that he's the head of a regime whose entire founding principle was sort of Islamic fundamentalism. It became Saudi Arabia because the Saud families not only embraced but married into the Wahhabi Muslim sect. And to think that we're going to transform them, and for Israel or the United States to not merely just facilitate trade and sort of wake them up to the reality of the Lord, but to think that that is going to transform the Muslim Middle East, that's probably a bridge too far. Like, it's a great thing, but it's not going to change everything. I think part of the problem with the Abraham Accords is not, what it tried to do, and it's cutting the Palestinians out, as I say, no longer holding the rest of the world hostage, but it's not going to change sort of Muslim opinion in the Middle East to being Zionist.
Yes, but does that have to be changed to deal with the Palestinian problem?
Does that have to be changed? Well, I'm not that optimistic about the Palestinian problem being solved. I hate to, it's like I gave you an optimistic kind of speech, but I'm not trying to, sort of pull the wool over your eyes. I'm not here. This is a realistic optimism, not messianism. To think that the Palestinians are going to be transformed and have the political sea change within their culture when their whole national identity is inextricably tied with the war against the Jews and Zionism. That may happen someday, just as the Messiah may come someday. Speedily and in our days, of course, we always add. But, that's not going to happen anytime soon. They're going to, I don't see any sign of that happening. Not even after what happened. They should be drawing conclusions from what happened in the war that they started on October 7th, but they're not drawing conclusions from it. So I don't see that problem being solved. I've lived my entire adult life as a journalist. It's like debating these issues and covering these issues. I've had, I've had conversations that I could have had 30 years ago and even 40 years ago when I was a kid. And, it's like 40 years ago, we were having discussions in the Jewish community about, the current situation in Judea, Samaria, the West Bank is unsustainable. Like, Israel's presence there cannot be sustained indefinitely. And everybody would be nodding along, yeah, that's right. Well, here we are 40 years later. It's still there. It's not going away. It's not being solved because the people on the other side don't want to solve it. When they want to solve it, the Oslo process and all the optimism about a new Middle East that Shimon Peres, of blessed memory, was selling the Jewish people in the world. It was based on an idea that a fundamental transformation was happening, if not about to happen. And alas, he was wrong about that. Some of us were right that he was wrong at the time, and he and his supporters were very mean, to those of us who were noticing that fact. But that wasn't happening then. You know, the reason why there's virtually no appreciable support for a two-state solution in Israel anymore is because kind of tried that. Listen, what was Gaza before October 7th except but an independent Palestinian state in all but name? And you know, what did that, you know, like that didn't solve the conflict. It just made it worse. So, you know, the Palestinian problem isn't going away. It is a long-running headache ulcer that the Jewish people, the people of Israel, are going to have to live with indefinitely. But what's the choice? You know, the choices are: we live with it, we deal with the problems, and we go on and we prosper and we grow and we thrive. Or you can be like Peter Beinart and say, like, let's close up shop and we'll, you know, give in. Well, you know what? We're not giving in. He's wrong. Nobody's listening to him. And except, you know, the editorial board of the New York Times, which, as I said, doesn't really matter anymore. So there you are. Long-winded answer to a very pertinent question.
Are you going to call
I
on
have
a
a-
woman? Because you just called on 3 men. I'm just saying.
I have a question.
We'll definitely call on you. Don't think I'm not going anywhere. My flight is until 3:30.
I have a question about the clarity of the response to nationalism on the right. It seems that people haven't been drawing a sufficiently bright line between the neo-Nazis and the Groypers, who are bad, and the nationalists who we have to think are good, because if you say nationalism is racism, you're saying Zionism is racism. How can we handle this better than has been going on in the last few months?
That's a really interesting question. I'm someone who's, you know, I've written a lot about that. I, you know, just recently again interviewed Yoram Hazony, who, you know, is the American-born Israeli head of the Edmund Burke Foundation, the foundation promoting, you know, sort of national conservatism and the ideas, you know, that have their origins in the writings in the great 18th century English political philosopher Edmund Burke. And, you know, he wrote about, you know, he's written about the importance of nationalism, that is a good thing. It has its roots. I mean, there were 2 really important books written this year, one by, you know, JNS's Melanie Phillips, and also by another one by Josh Hammer, you know, important young political commentators. They kind of wrote the same book, albeit from a British and American perspective. And I know this because, you know, I interviewed them both for my podcast, and I was reading both books. And when I was reading the second, I was saying, wait a minute, I've read this before. You know, don't tell them I said that. But, so yes, nationalism is good. Israeli nationalism is good. American nationalism is good. There's nothing wrong with saying America first. You know, like, don't say it. No, it shouldn't mean what Charles Lindbergh meant. It shouldn't mean what Tucker Carlson meant. Although I don't think he really believes in America first. I think he believes in America only, if that. So we have to speak up for the right of the Jewish people to have their own country, just as we should speak up for our own interests as Americans. These dark forces of the left, and especially of the right, you know, the Groypers, the Nick Fuentes, the Candace Owens lunatics, it is a distortion of the American idea. These people don't believe in the ideals of the American Republic that was created by the generation of the founders. They don't believe in it at all. And so we have to defend these things. It's, you know, unfortunately, most of the young people, as the gentleman who asked the question about the internet, like most young people don't know any more about the ideals of the American Republic than they know about, you know, like, you know, the man on the moon. We don't, you know, fundamentally, the failures of our culture, you know, is a failure of education in this country. We don't teach history. We teach ideology. You know, that's the problem. One of the great things, and one of the reasons why, which I should have talked more about, but I could have gone on forever, I probably went on too long, is that, you know, the woke, you know, progressives are in retreat in large part because of what Trump is trying to do. He's scaring the lives out of them by threatening to, you know, pull their public, you know, their federal funding. And, you know, sort of Harvard's answer is that anti-Semitism is much too important for us to give up cancer research for. It's like we won't forswear our woke anti-Semitism if it, even if it means the cancer research has to stop. But in truth, education has failed the American people. Can we change that? Well, that's a big issue. Some people are trying, but when you take away their money, they'll learn. Unfortunately, one of the conundrums is that the Republicans have preached for a generation that the Department of Education in Washington is useless and it needs to be abolished. But the only way they're going to actually affect the transformation of American education and to rout the woke progressives who have done so much damage to our system is by having an education department in place to implement that process. So it's like banning the Muslim Brotherhood and cozying up to Qatar. Like there's a lot of cognitive dissonance going on in Washington today, just as the Democrats have their own brands of cognitive dissonance. So I think we need to speak up for these ideals. We need to highlight them. We need to, within our own community, there's so much sort of antediluvian thinking about nationalism. That the Nazis had the last word about national ideals. No. Don't believe them. Believe you should listen. Read Edmund Burke, not Adolf Hitler. That would be the one sentence answer to that. So yes, I can believe that young lady
All right.
deserves a question.
Thank you so much. First of all, thank you for coming, and I listen to your podcast every day. Look forward to everything that you say. I'm really, really thrilled to be here and see you in person. But I think one thing that you didn't mention, I'm sure there are others, but follow the money. I think we hear on a lot of different podcasts, and maybe yours as well, that Qatar and all of these primary Muslim places, like communities, whatever, countries are giving tons of money, tons and tons of money, and that is why we have all these departments now in the United States that are, instead of Jewish Judaic studies, there's now Arab studies, and Muslims who are in charge, Columbia, everywhere, Cornell. I think this is something we can't ignore, and I don't know if you have thoughts on how do we fight against that, but and again, I appreciate all your encouraging rhetoric and trying to make us feel not as oppressed or sad or catastrophizing, but my mother went through the Holocaust from Germany, and she said her parents were always saying, how great the Germans were, how nothing could ever happen to the Jews. They were such wonderful, brilliant people, and they never left. And I do feel personally, having grown up with that as a background, that I do feel we are in a very bad situation, especially again with the money, because money controls things, and these people have infiltrated into every parts of our society and in these most highest levels everywhere. So anyway, thank you.
Thank you. And those were two really important questions that you properly linked. Let me talk about money. For sure. We do talk about it a fair amount in country NS. Qatar is a malign, Qatar is the focus of it. Qatar does, 20 years ago we would have spoke of the Saudis. They were funding the madrasas around the world. But today, the Saudis gave up that. That was, they after 9/11, they began the process of understanding, why are we funding people that want to kill us? Forget about the Jews. Qatar is now the focus of that. They are the hosts. They are the funders of Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, Hezbollah, and they are the most successful, people, as I said before, talk about AIPAC. They are the most successful influence operation in the world. Al Jazeera, this dominant media source in the Middle East, is their creature. They have spread money all around, they're the biggest donors to American education, biggest foreign donors, American education. They have funded Middle East studies. The truth is, Israel studies and Judaic studies, the problems there, is that most of the people who teach, Middle East and Israel studies now are as anti-Israel as, as the people being funded by Qatar, which were all and these are departments all funded by Jews, not Qatar. So Qatar's influence is pervasive. It's pervasive inside of both the Democrat and the Republican Party. They bailed out Steve Witkoff. I talk about this all the time because very few other people are talking about it. He was stuck with a losing bill, in his real estate operation. They paid $600 million for a property that he couldn't sell, that he was eating. So he's compromised. Does it explain everything about him? Maybe not, but it explains something. And so their money is pervasive. What can we do about it? Well, if this administration, or any administration, wanted to restrict the ability of foreign funders to give to American higher education or American education, they could. That could be very easily implemented. And I think if Qatar hadn't such a successful, influence operation, it already would have been. So there's an easy fix to Qatar and its money. But let me say something else. I may have forgotten the second part of your question, but it's not all about money, though. As much as, yes, you should always follow the money. That's a principle of journalism. The people who are teaching these terrible ideas to our children, they would do it whether Qatar was paying them or not. The woke progressive, the ideologues who have pushed this movement, this indoctrination. It's not just about who is funding them, whether it's George Soros and his pervasive influencing operation, and he's a Hungarian Jew by birth, but and he's done more damage, frankly, to this country than just about any other single person, and that's not an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. That's just the truth. All these, pro-crime prosecutors all over America, and he's bragged about it, on the pages of the Wall Street Journal. But the point is, a lot of these people would be doing it whether, Qatar or Soros or anybody else was paying them or not. This is a battle that is not just about money. It's a battle of ideas. It must be fought in the marketplace of ideas. That's why I keep talking about courage and faith and all this, which is not just to pump us up, which we need pumping up, but because this is, a battle of ideas. And we have to speak up and fight that battle. America, has been transformed by people who believed in the power of ideas. That was true in the generation of the founders. One of the things that we've been talking about is the right has its problem with the growth of anti-Semitism from within its ranks, because we focus a lot about the left, is that a generation or two ago, the leading political figure, the leading thinker of the modern right, modern founder of modern American conservatism, William F. Buckley, who many Jews didn't like because he was a conservative and, he was a Catholic and he was, National Review was not, their cup of tea. But he chased the anti-Semites out of modern conservatism. He expelled the John Birch Society from polite conservative society in the 1960s. And then in 1990, he chased Pat Buchanan out of mainstream conservatism, and Joe Sobran, when he wrote In Search of Anti-Semitism. Nowadays, people like Tucker Carlson say the problem is that is gatekeeping, but we need more gatekeeping. But let me also briefly, which is hard for me, I know, touch on what you said about Germany and America. And yes, your grandparents or your great-grandparents were wrong about Germany. And that is something that haunts Jews, because they weren't the first Jewish community to be wrong about where they lived. The Spanish Jews thought they were never going anywhere either, right? And 100 other places. Is America exceptional? Well, it doesn't, nothing, as one of my mentors, one of the great Eugene Rice, under whom I studied history at Columbia back during the Ice Age. He said something that I've never forgot. I've often quoted it. And he said, nothing in history is inevitable. Everything is evitable in history. So, of course, it could change. In journalism, we have a rule. We never use the word never, because there's no such thing as never. But, so long as America holds to the ideals of its founders, so long as it looks to the ideals of Western civilization, which is founded on the wisdom of Jerusalem, Athens, and Rome, not exclusion of any one of those three, America will be exceptional. As long as, as long as we see the world differently here on these shores than the people in Europe and Asia have. And we have for, nearly 250 years, right? Then the Jews are saved. The America that we grew up in is exceptional. It's not like any other place in the world. We have to defend that America. The answer is not to give up, because, it isn't Germany in 1933, where, most Germans were anti-Semitic, because that was Europe. Most Americans, people who have come from all over the world, I'm not going to, read you the Statue of Liberty poem and all that stuff. But the truth is, America is a different country. It's not a blood and soil. Nationalism here means something different than nationalism other places, because it's not blood and soil in the way that it is in Hungary or in France or any other places. And I'm not denigrating Hungary, especially Hungary, which is the most pro-Israel, safest place for Jews in Europe, but which is denounced by a lot of liberals. But I don't want to get off on the Hungary sidetrack. But the point is, nationalism here is very different. So we have to defend that nationalism, not give up on it. And if we do, I think we'll win. I believe in that. Be'emunah shalema, with perfect faith. Now, that doesn't mean we will if we give up, if we let them, if we abandon the field, if we shelter in place, yeah, for sure. American exceptionalism, if we don't rout the woke progressives out of the colleges, sure, America will no longer be exceptional, and 100 years from now, it'll be a very different place, and it might not be a safe place for Jews. But that doesn't have to happen. And in fact, we can prevent it from happening. And we have allies willing to fight with us to prevent that from happening. And I can't emphasize that enough. So let's have faith. This isn't Germany, and it won't be Germany so long as we're willing to fight.
Not only that, if you're looking for faith, right now as we speak, we have Frederick Merz, the German Chancellor, meeting with Bibi Netanyahu, and they're exchanging billions of dollars of arms 80 years later.
Yeah.
World can change.
Yes.
Hi. So I have two things. One of them about Israel and the North. So the North is still empty. So let's not forget.
It's a little less empty than it was a year ago, but still.
Yeah, but still,
I understand why the people in the North are slow to go back to their homes and slow to trust that the ceasefire can last. But the truth is, every time you hear about Israel pounding Lebanon and they say, oh, you're violating the ceasefire, it's because they're trying to change the environment so that the people can go home and can have faith that it will change. So yes.
That's a simple fact. The second thing is, what do you think about the West Bank, and what should Israel do with the West Bank? Because there is a big issue there with the population, the settlement. Even today, last week, the government took out 16 illegal settlements, but that doesn't solve any of the big problems of the West Bank.
Well, the truth is, I kind of alluded to this before, it's an anomalous situation, which is not going to change, because, it's like, in theory, a two-state solution would work. If you could draw a line and the Jews would be on one side and the Palestinian Arabs would be on the other side, and they could have their state and everything would be nice. Coexistence, two states for two peoples, la, la, la. Except the people on the other side of the line who have been offered an independent state several times, countless times for the last 100 years. We can go through the whole history lesson, 1937, 1947, 2000, 2001, Ehud Barak's offers, Ehud Olmert's offers. Netanyahu even said he was where, when Obama pressured him, and the Palestinians they don't want a two-state solution. They don't want an independent Palestinian state if it means being alongside Israel. And as long as that is true, the anomalous situation in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, will continue. The Jews who live there are not going away. There are some 700,000 Jews living over the Green Line. The dream of, whether it was a sort of Arab or leftist Jewish dream of making them move back to inside the Green Line, that's a pipe dream. That is never happening. I would argue it shouldn't happen, but the point is, it won't. And the reason why it won't, just as the reason why the Israeli right has won most of the elections in the last 30 years, is because the Palestinians keep electing them. Why did Netanyahu win all those elections? Because he's so lovable. Trust me, he's not that lovable. I mean, he's a really smart guy, and I think in many ways, there were questions to be asked about October 7th, but his conduct of the war and his ability to stand up to America as well as to work with America, it's kind of been, the last 2 years has kind of been his finest hour, I should add that. But the reason why he won all those elections, the reason why he might win the next election, which some people, on the Jewish left, it blows their minds, is because the Palestinians have elected him all these times. So this insult, the problem with the Palestinians, which is the problem of the West Bank, as you put it, is in its current formulation insoluble. And when you have an insoluble problem, you have to work around it. As I said, my entire adult life has been spent discussing this insoluble problem, and we're not going to solve it. So we just have to live around it. That is hard for a lot of people, especially a people that help sort of invent messianism. It's like, that is like a very on brand for us, that there's no such thing as an insoluble problem. We can solve it. That's a very American way of looking at things. If there's a problem, let's meet somewhere in the middle. That is not how the Middle East, it's not how the Israeli-Palestinian problem, the West Bank problem works. As long as the Arabs are not willing to live in peace with a Jewish state, no matter where its borders are drawn, that situation will continue. It will continue. Right now, I think it will continue. My if I have my daughter doesn't have any children yet, but God willing, she will. Maybe one of them will be a journalist, and 50 years from now, that putative grandson or granddaughter of mine will be here as a Jewish journalist, talking. Hopefully, the synagogue is still standing too. And we could be happy, and someone could be asking them the same question you asked me, and they'll have to give it the same answer. So,
that Netanyahu never got the maximum 25% of the votes.
Well, the Israeli system is not one where anybody can win. David Ben-Gurion didn't win a majority.
I know.
There was no such thing as okay, so sure, but so what? He won all those elections by the way the Israeli rules work. If it was possible, but the truth is, and I'm not really here as a Bibi defender apologist. There are people in his circle that don't love me, but the truth is, he's still, when the Israelis are asked who is the person you want to be prime minister, which is a different question from a Knesset election, he always comes out first. Listen, he hasn't groomed a successor either. As I to stand here, as my daughter would like to say, stand here and quote myself. It's not that so much that he doesn't believe that he hasn't groomed a successor. It's because he doesn't believe in the concept. Let him live to be 120. Maybe he'll be a prime minister until he's 120. But until the basic political facts change, he will still be there. And as long as God gives him strength to go on, so he will. And yes, that young lady back there.
One thing we haven't discussed is something that struck me very forcibly when I read one of the Jewish publications I read, is it time for Jews who have historically supported all of the non-Jewish, very liberal charities, the ACLU, the NAACP, etc., to decide that, okay, all these groups that we supported in the name of liberal social justice have not stood up for us, And now it's our time to put all the money and all the power that we had devoted to supporting them as well as Jewish causes, strictly to Jewish causes. And I, for one, have been very, very conflicted about this, because my husband and I have given widely, to the limits of what we can do. I'm not saying we're huge donors, but every penny counts. And in the last 2 years, after reading that article, I have given nothing to anything that is not Jewish related. The joint, the this, the that. And I wonder how you feel about it, and what the morality of it is, and how other people, including the rabbi, feel about it. Because I'm very conflicted, but I really, truly feel that right now that's the thing to do.
Well, you make a very, the two organizations you cited, the ACLU and the NAACP, have certainly turned on the Jews. They were organizations like many. They sort of stand in for a whole bunch of different groups that we could cite, who were heavily supported by Jews, who were considered as allies of the Jews. And, not so much when Israel came under attack, but when American Jewry came under attack, they were to be found among the attackers, not among our allies and defenders. And yes, I think anybody who gives to them and who has any sense of Jewish peoplehood, needs to have their head examined. The founder of Home Depot, Bernie Marcus, was a great man. He's no longer with us, but I had him on my podcast a couple of years ago, in the last year, I think, before he died. And he said any Jew who gives to Harvard needs their head examined. That's a good quote, and he's right, because these are institutions that have failed us. Now, within Judaism, within Jewish identity, the Jewish peoplehood, there's always been these two conflicting but also compatible ideas of Jewish particularism, and universalism. That is Judaism. It's both, we're both a tribe, a people, an ethno-religious people with a land and an ideology that is rooted in a place and a sense of a national identity. We're also this universalist faith. We speak of our God as not just is the God of Israel, but he's the God of the whole world. Those two ideas have always sort of rested uneasily alongside each other throughout Jewish history. And, I think, in the words of Rabbi Amiel Hirsch, who is, the rabbi, a leading rabbi in Reform Judaism, he's the rabbi of the Stephen Weiss Free Synagogue in New York. And he has written and he's spoken, he spoke on my podcast, and the balance got out of kilter within liberal Judaism, which is a term that applies to conservative Judaism as well as Reform Judaism. We became a little too universalist. We became more concerned with others than with ourselves. And as a result, some of us have been disillusioned, some of us have abandoned Jewish peoplehood altogether. So I think it's very important for Jews who care about their own people, who have maybe been, mugged by the reality of what's happened, not just in the last 2 years, but in the last generation, to rethink their alliances, rethink where they put their resources, because there are consequences from bad decisions along those lines. I don't think we're ever going to get Jews not to care about the other non-Jewish concerns as well, because that also is baked into our DNA. It's baked into our ideology. It's baked into our religion. But we have to get the balance back, and especially in this country, especially among very secular and often politically liberal Jews, the balance has been out of kilter. And I think there are people within, say, the Reform movement, they're within liberal Judaism, and I'm not known as a political liberal, that's, truth disclaimer there. I think they have understood that if they want to preserve the Jewish people in this country, that has to change. How much. How much progress have they made in convincing people? I don't know. We're going through, a demographic transformation in this country when it comes to the Jews. Our numbers are shrinking, in case you hadn't noticed, because of assimilation and things like intermarriage and all these factors. And part of it is good news, because the reason for all this assimilation and intermarriage is because Americans don't hate us. Most Americans love us. And they even want to marry us. So, that is good news, bad news. So, we have to understand that, the Jewish community that sort of was alive when we were young in the 50s and 60s, with cathedral synagogues and all this, that's not the Jewish community that's going to be here. And it's not the Jewish community of now. It's like in 1990 when the Jewish population survey, first serious Jewish population survey came out, and they noticed that half of the Jews who were not Orthodox were intermarrying. And it's like, all the Jewish Federation executives in America, it's like their hair went on fire, because like, oh my God, nobody's going to be around to pay our salaries soon. And then let's put some money into education and camps and schools and, trips to Israel. And they were right, and that did good. But, like 30 years later, we're already here. And everybody acknowledged that the number today would be more like 75, 80%, if not higher. So that, it's like, we're there already. It's like, if you don't have a plan, you're already there, right? So we're in a situation where this community is changing. A lot of the people, it's going to be smaller. A lot of the people who claim Jewish origin are going to be like your senator, who was like, 132nd or 164th Indian, if you believe that. And so it's like, it's a link to something exotic, something tragic. A lot of the people who claim Jewish origin in the coming generations won't really be Jewish in any meaningful sense. But those of us who are left, and there will be Jews who are left, are probably going to be more Jewish, more concerned, and be listening to the concerns that you just articulated, and that's just demographic facts.
In the interest of finishing close to time, we'll have one more question. That'll be followed by Birkat on page 62 in Hatikva, and then Mr. Tobin is kind enough to stay afterward to answer other questions.
First of all, Jonathan, I want to thank you for decades of journalistic integrity, much of which we know from our 40 years in Connecticut. For the last 16 years, my husband and I have been splitting our time between Israel and the United States. I heard from an Israeli friend last night, and she asked me to tell you that you have fans in Israel as well, and to ask you this question. Who or what are your sources for your worldview? Who do you read? Who do you listen to? Where do you get your perspective? Because the one thing that you seem to have that most mainstream journalists lack is a sense of perspective. I always refer to you as the voice of reason when I take one of your essays and put it into my Israel News of the Week. And my friend used the same expression, the voice of reason. So what is the source of that?
Well, thank you very much. I think, I should just, you should come up and give the speech. But listen, I try to read as much, just in terms of basic, everyday, I try to read as much as possible, read as many, skim as many, as you can do that now because everything's on the internet. Al Gore invented the internet, and so therefore, you can read every news. It used to be like if you wanted to read a wide variety of newspapers, like there were one place in every city. In New York, when I grew up, there was like one store downtown New York where you could buy every newspaper in the world, and that was, to me, that was like heaven. Nowadays, you just turn on your computer and you can read. I try to read as widely, left-wing sources, right-wing sources, opinion magazines, newspapers. So that's how I go about my daily business. More broadly, which is I think what you're trying to get at, I am a reader of history. I am a consumer of, sort of basic, knowledge about our past and analysis there. That's what I am interested in. That's, that tends to be more of the books the authors that I interview on my podcast. I'm also, you're sort of getting at like, if I'm getting you right, like what is so what set me on this path? Who were the people that influenced me? You know, and I actually referenced him earlier. William F. Buckley, who was, as I said, the intellectual, who was the founder of modern American conservatism. He also sort of founded Talking Heads, TV shows. And Firing Line, his show that was on for many years, usually on public television in some places, which was an hour-long interview show, where he had all sorts of people, not just people who agreed with him. And it was deeply intellectual. It was about history, it was about civilization and thought, and even music. That opened up the world of ideas to me. And I have tried to, and speaking of someone who I wrote for a while for National Review, so, I'm sort of part of that tradition. But I'm deeply influenced by the way he, not necessarily thought about each individual issue, but about that approach, the sort of a civilizational approach of understanding history, ideas. I'm in the Jewish ideas business. I'm not in the parties and politics and politicians business. I may agree with people now, whether here or in Israel. I may disagree with them other times. I'm in the ideas business. And that's what drives me, and that's what informs me, informs my daily journalism. And I do daily journalism, as those of you who read JNS know. I'm scribbling, like every day. I write 3 or 4 columns a week. I do a daily, weekly video podcast. I do daily podcasts. I'm interested in the world of ideas and thought and serious analysis. I'm also rooted in what is, not necessarily of what I want things to be. I mean, that's part of what it means, at least what I was taught, what it means to be a journalist, to convey the world as it is, not necessarily as I want it to be. And I think that informs not just my work, I believe it informs what we do at JNS every day, in terms of providing an honest view of the world from a Jewish perspective, covering the news about America, Israel, the Jewish world, opinion, and not every, you may not agree with everything you read there, but that is what informs how we work, how we try, and it's why what our staff is trying to do. It's not just about me, although you can talk more about me if you want, but that is what we're trying to do. I believe there is a great lack of that. I tried to convey that in my previous remarks. I think we need more of fact-based, history-based, ideas and understanding of the world. And if we do, I think it only redounds to our favor. That's what we should encourage. I believe that's what you as consumers of news and opinion should support. JNS is also a nonprofit. Without the help of our readers, everything in journalism other than maybe a couple of publications, or everything's a nonprofit, including the Washington Post. It's just has one donor, Jeff Bezos, who's the richest, who made another $200 million while we were talking here this morning. So it's a question of what you're supporting. True, I mean, you're all investing, in what, you're not just complaining about the media or consuming the media. You're making decisions about the media. So what you support also has an impact on what you're seeing and what the next generation sees. So we hope you'll support what we do as well. So thank you very much.